o'clock news and politics hour. Ava Gaudet was live at 3 with her entertainment show. We appreciate your tuning in as we do every Tuesday. We talk with Jennifer Lawless down at American University. How are you today, Jennifer?
I'm great. How are you?
We are good up here. All eyes down in D.C. What's the bigger news, Roy Moore or Jeff Sessions? Roy Moore, Jeff Sessions, what's the bigger news down in D.C.?
Sorry, you were cutting out. I would say that Roy Moore remains the number one story, not only because of the election, but also because of what the Senate has the option to do, even if he wins the election. So Sessions is certainly a close second, but right now discussion is about the election itself, whether he'll be seated, and then ultimately whether he'll be expelled.
So what's happening now? We're seeing members sort of line up even, ahead of time in their support. Do you have to be on one side or the other at this point?
Well, I think you have to be on one side or the other if you are worried that your decision could ultimately cost you your own reelection in 2018. If it turns out that these allegations are true, or if it turns out that Roy Moore wins the election, comes to DC, and then engages in any sort of behavior that further reaffirms these kinds of allegations, it's hard to imagine the Democrats not making this a national campaign and trying to smear any Republican who didn't call for his expulsion. Basically they'll be held accountable in a way that maybe Roy Moore is not.
What's your expectation, looking at polling numbers, seeing what's both taking place in the race itself? Let's start with that, standing here today. If you're a betting woman, what do you expect from the race?
If the election were held today, I think there's a very good chance that he would lose. But we learned that a month is an eternity in politics. And you might recall last year at around this time, a couple of weeks prior, the Access Hollywood tape had come out. Donald Trump seemed like there was no path to the White House. The Republicans were talking about how to get Mike Pence on the ballot and what the logistics involved. And Donald Trump wound up with a pretty clear victory. So it's unclear to me. A lot will depend on what the governor of Alabama decides to do and whether Luther Strange or perhaps Jeff Sessions becomes the write-in candidate.
And so let's talk, if the election goes forward, if Roy Moore does go back, and we talk about who's lining up on which side and whether the question of expulsion happens, could you foresee that happening?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to figure out how not to seat him in the first place. The Senate rules don't make that very clear, and there's virtually no precedent. For expulsion, you need 2/3 of the senators. You've got every single Democrat, and it's not that difficult to identify the remaining third from the Republicans. You already have people like Mitch McConnell or Cory Gardner saying that under no circumstances should this man serve. So the question really becomes, though, I think, for a lot of these Republicans, what does it mean if he's seated and then expelled? Does that mean that he winds up with the same benefits that a senator has for the rest of his life? And does that wind up costing taxpayers money? So there are lots of other issues here beyond just the logistics. There might be strong disincentives to even have him appear on the ballot in the first place.
So let's talk. You talk about the amount of time before the election itself and being an eternity. We did just see another woman come forth. Will it continue to dominate, even in the absence of new accusations? Will it continue to dominate the news cycle?
I say this every week. Yes, I think a story has legs, and then something else more outrageous becomes more prevalent, and the story kind of dies down. It seems to me that in this case, it will continue to dominate unless there is some kind of proof that Roy Moore is able to put forward to suggest that all of these women are not telling the truth. I can't imagine any scenario whereby that happens, especially given that their stories are incredibly compelling. They have signed yearbooks. It's sort of not appropriate for a grown man to be signing a teenager's yearbook. He was not a teacher in the school. There are, suggestions that this was behavior that a lot of people in Alabama knew about and kind of swept under the rug. So, the one circumstance that I would see that would put this to sleep seems very unlikely to happen.
So I know I started off by saying Roy Moore or Jeff Sessions, but we did hear testimony before the House Judiciary today, again, in his role, saying that he doesn't think that there's pressure being placed on him looking into dealings with Russia. And also not ruling out the possibility of looking into Hillary Clinton. What have we learned from the Sessions testimony so far?
Well, we've learned that once again, he has no recollection of anything. I mean, this time he's also noted that he doesn't remember the conversation with Papadopoulos, but he assumes that he probably said we shouldn't get involved. That's a lot not to recollect.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I think that the investigation of the Clinton Foundation is a way to say, oh, look, a bauble, and let's try to distract. We know that the one thing that continues to unify Republicans, even when they're split regarding Donald Trump, even when they're split regarding Roy Moore, is their visceral reaction to Hillary Clinton. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that the administration and even the players that have been somewhat marginalized by this administration, like Jeff Sessions, realize that Hillary Clinton is something that can bring everybody together.
And so, obviously there's other outstanding issues in D.C. right now. And one of the ones I wanted to ask you about, Trump Jr. and the WikiLeaks connection. What's the talk been about that down there?
That this guy is so naive that it's actually unbelievable. I mean, this is now the second or third time that Donald Trump Jr. has, in an attempt to explain what really happened, make his own circumstances and those of his father and the entire administration that much worse. I don't know who told him that it would be a good idea to release on his own all of this correspondence, but I mean, it's very damning, and in some ways, it's the first piece of evidence that Donald Trump knew what was going on, because about 15 minutes after an exchange between Don Jr. and WikiLeaks, in which WikiLeaks suggested to Don Jr. that he tell his father it would be nice to tweet about, these emails, the test emails, Donald Trump did. Right, so that's a pretty damning piece of evidence to suggest that Donald Trump was familiar with what was going on. And, the other time that we really had damning evidence of something that seemed untoward was when Don Jr. released the emails earlier in the summer, and Donald Trump, I guess, rewrote his response for him, suggesting that he was very, very involved there too. So, I think this was a terrible week for the administration, and it's only Tuesday.
It's only Tuesday. But let's talk about that. There's always that maxim of never say in an elevator that which you wouldn't want splashed on the front page of a news site. I mean, do you think they just got the sense, while it was going on, they must just think that they would never get caught? To put a lot of that in email form is one thing, or did they just not think it was wrong?
I think they thought they were not going to win. And if they would have lost, perhaps they would have been building good relationships for future business dealings. And if they would have lost, nobody would be, I think they assume, sort of rifling through their trash and their emails and trying to figure out what happened. So I think that was part of it. I think the other part of it was that they don't know what's legal and what's not legal. They don't know what's collusion and what's not collusion. They've always played by their own rules, and they've never been held accountable. And I think we're seeing that. The fact that it was a pretty non-professional campaign apparatus basically exacerbated the Trump family's propensity to behave in sort of an unconventional way. And maybe some of these side deals and informal conversations in business are the way that you get things done, but in politics, they're the way you get indicted.
So when do you think we see the first book of this, How Not to Collude for Dummies? Do we expect something fairly soon from political scientists? As you say, not knowing, maybe I shouldn't have reached out to them. Is this just ripe for the taking, that either someone takes it from a factual standpoint or even a humorous one?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that you even need How Not to Collude for Dummies, because dummies know how not to collude, right? In a lot of ways, that's what's so insane about this. If you ask the average person walking down the street if it's okay to have Russia intervene in U.S. elections and ultimately try to get Hillary Clinton to lose, that person is going to say, no, that seems probably wrong. Right? So, I think the Trump family might benefit from the book, but I'm not sure that anybody else in the country needs to read it.
Speaking of reading things, I've got my hit list of items I want to go down here with you, but this segues into an article that you were involved with regarding the importance of local journalism. Now, this was pertaining to the demise of the Gothamist, but talk with us a little bit about that. Here we are in Providence, Rhode Island, really bringing journalism right to the local level here. How much of a need is there for it throughout the country?
So there's a huge need, and there's a pretty big void. And basically what Danny Hayes and I have found was that if you look at coverage of House campaigns to the House of Representatives, even just comparing 2010 to 2014, you see a net decrease in coverage, even taking into account how competitive the race is.
Mm-hmm.
And that decline in coverage, we know, actually makes voters less likely to turn out to vote, less likely to know about their candidates, and less likely to be able to evaluate them. And these are the same voters in both 2010 and 2014. So it's clear that they're relying on local news coverage. It's just that in 2014, they're less likely to get it. And unfortunately, the incentives to provide it are dwindling as well. So despite the fact that it's vital and necessary, people are not that inclined to tune in unless it's very, very easy and appealing and fun for them. And there are just not that many sites across the country that are offering the kinds of services that you guys frankly are. And our general sense is that without more of this kind of coverage, we're going to continue to see less and less democratic accountability and less participation.
Well, from a Democratic standpoint, politics aside, I'll just give you an example. The recent events that took place here in Providence involving police officers and a fatal shooting, national coverage, including the AP, contextualized the shooting as a shootout. Now, this again is folks perhaps going to national sources, which was just erroneous. It was not, in fact, a shootout. It was police shooting at a vehicle. So the need for local journalism and folks on the ground clearly is there. Here at Go Local, teamed up with pollster John Delabope. We had our first benchmark poll for 2018. We're going to be providing more. But it was interesting, we talk every Tuesday to see that piece, just you're reiterating the need and the app, for folks to have that at their disposal, especially from a democracy standpoint. So let's finish off by talking policy at the end of the day here. I do know that the Democrats did just send out that kind of e-blast this afternoon questioning the tax reform vote that could take place with no CBO score?
Right, which is basically the new way to make sure that nothing gets passed. Without a CBO score, it's impossible to know what it's going to cost and who's going to pay the price. It's impossible to have any kind of objective indicator of the likelihood that X percentage of the middle class will benefit from these cuts while another X percentage will actually see their taxes go up. And so that means that it's dead on arrival as far as Democrats are concerned. And it also makes it very, very difficult for Republicans to go back to their districts or their states and make a strong case for it because it's based just on their own hopes and dreams. And we've seen when that happened with repealing and replacing Obamacare, that time and again, when the CBO score was either not that favorable or not yet calculated, Republicans were unable to pass anything.
I mean, the Republicans' justification for not having a CBO score, how do they justify it?
That the Democrats have been difficult and that the process has taken longer and that there's feet dragging, and as a result, like if we wait even longer, we're going to wind up, in even, in more dire straits, and we need to get this done by the end of the calendar year. But frankly, life happens, lots of distractions occur on a regular basis. Most of the delays in Congress are not because of the Democrats, but it's because the Republicans can't get their ducks in a row. So, I think that kind of defense falls on deaf ears. And at the end of the day, when voters go to cast ballots in 2018, they're not going to reelect Republicans simply because Democrats were obstructionists. They're going to reelect Republicans if Republicans manage to get something done. And by all accounts, tax reform was supposed to be a lot easier than health care, and it doesn't look like it's shaping up that way.
A lot of things are difficult, and the final thing I do want to ask you about before you go, seems like there's a lot of talk regarding President Trump and his fingers on the nuclear codes. What's the sense down there, again, as tensions are continuing to be heightened in the Korean Peninsula, that they're trying to ensure these checks and balances with the president?
Well, I think that I think that tweets about, well, I can't believe Kim Jong-un called me old, I don't call him short and fat, even though I could, raises eyebrows, because quite frankly, this demonstrates that the president is taunting a dictator who we know is willing to engage in nuclear war. So whether the president himself says that he's joking or whether it was tongue-in-cheek, I think that, responsible people governing on both sides of the aisle need to make sure that just because he wakes up cranky one morning or offended by a tweet, that we're not going to actually find ourselves on the brink of nuclear war. And, questioning when you have generals, when you have former heads of the CIA and the FBI questioning the president's mental competence and wherewithal for this kind of position, this seems to me to be the next logical step, which is to make sure that he can't single-handedly basically blow up the world. And it's just unbelievable that we're having this conversation, but for 10 months now, he's given us plenty of reason to have it.
Well, again, no shortage of topics to touch base with you about inside the Beltway. Did we leave anything off?
I think that's it for this week. I mean, by next week, it'll be all new things.
It'll be all new things. Well, Jennifer Lawless, I, as always, appreciate your escaping into us here at the studio. We'll talk with you next Tuesday.